Welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with Rommana Software, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Effective Requirement Management for Project and Team Success using Rommana ALM by Dr. Maggie Hanna. We're excited you're able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is sponsored by Rommana Software, the leader in application lifecycle management technology. For more information on how Rommana Software can help you or your organization, please visit rommanasoftware.com. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, User Acceptance Testing in Agile Environment by Philip Liu, on September 14th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to testinginstitute.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at rommanasoftware.com. At the end of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. At Rommana Software, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Dr. Maggie Hanna. Dr. Hanna?
Thank you, Eric. All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining me from. Please, thanks for taking the time to be with me for this 45 minutes, an hour webinar to share with you, not necessarily a lot about Rommana ALM and the tool itself, but most importantly, what I'd like to share with you is all the good practices that we have learned over the years about requirement management and user story management. And as I say here, regardless if your project is agile or not, using user stories or requirements or both, there are some very best practices that we have learned over the years. And to be honest with you, I've seen, especially when projects are agile and they're using user stories, I can see some of those practices are no longer there. And the projects are very fast paced. We all want to finish things. And we forget completely that there is a discipline called requirement management and requirement engineering. So that's in your project to succeed, you got to practice good requirement management. And so what I'm going to do here, I'll give you what I call the 12 best practices in requirement management. And I'll explain them to you, and then at the end I will show you how Rommana ALM supports all those and more. Now, of course, that I'm hoping this webinar would help you go back to what you're doing in your project in terms of requirement management or even user story, and see if you have those practices or not. I'm not thinking that you're going to be able to implement all those 12, but at least you understand what they are. And please keep in mind, those best practices in requirement management are really my experience over the last, 28 years or so, just working with requirement management. And of course, when we started to use agile projects and we started to use user stories, I had to tweak some of those to apply to user stories. But very much, as I said in the previous slide here, most of these practices are the same. They apply equally for user stories and requirements. So let's get started. So I don't know how you are maintaining your requirements. Maybe I could get an idea from attendees about how you are maintaining the requirements for your projects. Some people are still using some form of Microsoft programs, or whether it is Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel, and some are using some other tools. So if you could just share with me through the questions panel and tell me what kind of tool you're using to maintain your requirements in your projects. And I will share this with the rest without, of course, mentioning names. So go ahead, click on the questions panel, and tell me if you're using Excel, Microsoft Word, Requisite Pro, Doors, whatever requirement tool you're using. All right. Okay, Excel, Word. All right. Previous employer used IBM Jazz. Some people are using Rational Suite from IBM. All right. Someone says we're using the comments section on the story, but I'm sure you are keeping those stories somewhere, either in a story, I'm going to call it user story management tool, if any, or just Microsoft Word. All right. Not much that I have expected, and it's very strange that I don't know why projects are not using the tools. Almost about, 27, 26 years ago, when I was when I was teaching at the university, I had that feeling because I was also doing consulting, and I found many companies are not using requirement management tools. Believe it or not, at that time, this Rommana ALM, the tool that I'm going to be showing you at the end of the webinar, was starting. And so I had written a very basic version of that tool using Visual Basic. And I have written it myself. And I was giving that tool to people that I teach requirements, because they say, if you're not using a requirement management tool, there's no reason for that. So I was giving it for free on a floppy disk. I'm sure you remember the floppy disks if you were around at the time. So I was giving it to my course attendees on a floppy disk, and I said, take this tool. It's a very simple. It has about 2 or 3 screens you can use to maintain your requirements, to get the status, because in the very basic requirements of a requirement management tool is nothing more than 2 or 3 tables with 2 or 3 screens, and you could do that. So that's what I did about 26 years ago. Continue to do this, of course, until we implemented Rommana ALM. Of course, that tool was not called Rommana ALM at the time. ALM, or Application Lifecycle Management, did not even exist at the time. I think I remember we called that tool RIC Test Pro. RIC Test Pro, because it was handling only requirements and test design in one tool. That RIC Test Pro tool from the older days have evolved over the years to become Rommana ALM, which is now have been awarded the best ALM tool and the best requirement tool and the best cloud solution. Okay, let me stop talking about the tool for now, because that's not really my main purpose. My main purpose is to discuss with you the best practice. Of course, we always have to know that requirements always exist in the hierarchy of details. Requirements are not maintained and should not be maintained in a flat list. It's not requirement 1, 2, 3, 4, because if you keep the requirements on one level, what I call flat list, then you don't have enough details about each requirement. You know, and I know that requirements have to exist in the form of, this is requirement number 1, this is 1.21, 1.22, 1.3, and if we have more details about requirement 1.1, then there is 1.2, 1.1, 1.12, 1.13, and so on. If the tool you're using, whether it is Microsoft Word, Excel, or whatever tool, does not allow you to do this, then that's not a good tool to use. Now, of course, people who are using Word documents, they can easily do that. They can use numbering and sub-numbering and so on, but you cannot refer to each individual requirement by itself, by its own number, and that's what's important, really. You have to be able to refer to that requirement number 1.2.3 by itself, and speak about it and find out what test cases you have for that requirement, and find out what code have we written for that requirement, and so on. So that's the first thing. Requirements must always be in a hierarchy of details. Now, when we speak about user stories, I get surprised. This is what it changed the whole thing in user stories. Why is it that we are not maintaining user stories in the hierarchy of details? And I fail to understand that. And in fact, I read it in a number of books that says, do not do sub-user stories. Well, we know that in user stories, if you use them, there is a concept of an epic, and an epic is a large user story that we can break it down into smaller number of user stories. But I don't want to confuse you here, so let's focus on requirements, and we want to make sure that our requirements are maintained in a level of detail, on certain level of details, or level of our hierarchy of details, to be able to describe more and more details. Now, the next one is about the different types of requirements. Any tool you use needs to allow you to specify different types of requirements. The most common type of requirement we know about is functional requirements. We know that. But let's not forget that there are all other kinds of requirements. There are even actually some people call them or refer to them as the other requirements. I don't like to use that term. And some other people say, okay, we have functional requirements and we have non-functional requirements. So again, I don't like the term non-functional requirements because it doesn't say much except that those are different from the functional requirements. But rather, in my own practice, I break requirements into functional and quality, for example, and those are the requirements that has to do with the quality or the goodness of the software. So those includes all the kind of things about performance, about ease of use, about reliability, survivability, about safety, and about security. All these are lumped together into one type of requirement called, I refer to them as quality requirements. But that's not all, because we still have other types of requirements. We may have, if you're doing, for example, medical devices, you may have a group or a set of requirements that stem from some sort of FDA regulations. So, and you don't want to call them requirements. You don't want to call them functional requirements. You don't want to call them quality requirements. So you might want to phrase or express them as such, and you call them FDA regulations. You might even have other requirements in any other business application that you want to call them business rules. Business rules are requirements. So some people get confused about the difference between the two. Business rules are nothing more than rules that must be enforced by the application. So you want to state them in your requirements as business rules, and you want to keep them as such. You don't want to confuse them with functional requirements. All right, and so on. And again, if you are building a system that involves hardware and software, like a medical device, for example, or any similar system, then you may have some requirements that are mostly hardware requirements, not software requirements. You have to be able to maintain that as hardware requirements. So as a result, the requirement management tool you're using needs to allow you to specify requirements of each type. I'm sure some of you would say, well, yeah, I can do this in a Word document. I can do this in a Excel or whatever. Well, and I don't even know if the IBM Jazz allow you to do this. Forgive me, I did not use it, so I don't know, but I suspect that it will, because if it doesn't, then it's not a professional level requirement management tool. All right, by the way, as Eric said, you can always post your questions on the questions panel, and I will answer those as often as I can. All right, now we get to the important stuff. Everyone knows that requirements are going to change over time. anything about the requirement is going to change, either the details or whatever. Okay, customers are going to change their mind. The developers are going to discover something different, or they're going to have a different understanding of the requirement. Then they go back to the customer. They clarify things with the customer. And then suddenly the requirement we worked with is not the same anymore. Or even after we release the software with the functionality working as is, the customer might come back and require some changes in the way the software works. All these fall in under the whole idea of change management. So if the requirement management tool will support change management, it needs to allow you to maintain different versions of the same requirement. And you should be able to go back and for these. It should say this is version 1 of the requirement the way it was stated last year. Now in August last year, the customer changed their mind, and here is the new version that we started to implement it in January. That was released in release 1.2, for example, and so on. Every time you get a change to an existing requirement, because guess what? We do the same for the code. I don't think we maintain only one version of the code. You know that, your developers know that. And when requirements change, we need to maintain a different version of the requirement, because the code that's associated, or the code that would be written to implement the change, is different. We're going to implement a different code. And if we have to associate code with requirements, then we really associate code and even test cases with different versions of the requirements. Okay, so as a result, versioning of the requirement is an essential component. And again, I'm going to suspect that if you are using a decent requirement management tool, not something like Jira. I mean, Jira is not a requirement management tool, but a lot of people use Jira for everything. They think it's a tool. It can be good for everything. Well, Jira has started to be only a bug tracking tool, and it is still bug tracking tool. Now, if you want to tweak it to use it to manage your test cases, to manage your requirements, it's up to you. But it does not do real requirement management. And I say this very clearly. Now, of course, a tool will allow you to keep track of the history of the changes. I mean, who changed this? Who changed this requirement? And when? And why? That's very critical, because we always want to go back and see how the requirement was before, how is it now, and why this change has been made. Trust me, if you work in projects, now the trouble is if you work in agile projects, that's never happened. That's never happened because we have user stories, and every project have different user stories. And even if we take a user story that we had implemented in a previous release and we change it, then somehow we create a new user story. That's not acceptable in my opinion, because now the developers are going to have to worry about what code that they have written for the first user story they can reuse in the second user story, and what type of relationship, how different the new user story from the old user story. Okay, and the test team will have the same kind of struggle. They're going to say, okay, I have already some test cases for another user story, which is a similar one. Now I wonder how much of those test cases I can use, and not even that. I mean, imagine the test team or the tester who wrote the test cases for the first user story is no longer there. And now we have a new tester who is writing the test case for the new user story. How on earth we're going to know that this user story is related or is a different version of the previous user story? I have not seen one single tool for user stories that maintains different versions of user stories. If you know of one, please share it with me through the questions panel so that at least I can learn for myself and I can share it with everyone else. Somehow, user story tools treat every user story as an independent one. But again, we cannot afford to do this, whether you're using user stories or requirements. Now, in order for the customer to request a change, there is some very essential concept that we have learned over the years. Somehow it got wiped out in the Agile framework, and that's the concept of change requests. Change request is an entity that's normally created when a customer changes their mind about anything in the functionality or in the quality, anything about the system. They want to change, they either initiate the change request or they communicated with the with the team, and the team will create a change request. But that change request need to be there, need to be created. We cannot just forget about it. We cannot just go ahead and make changes to the requirements without documenting the change request. And I'll tell you why we need that entity change request. Because when the customer proposes or requests a change, no one said that we're going to make the change. Even in the Agile framework, we say what? We say we always can work with the customer to try to accommodate any change they want, and if we can't accommodate the change in the same sprint or in the same release, it goes to the backlog and we can do it in another release. So in order to do this, then the change request from the customer needs to be maintained. It has to go through a process by which someone looks at it, decides if this is something that we can actually implement or not, or even if it makes any sense. So we work with the change request while it is change request. And once we agree and approve the change request, and we agree that we are actually going to implement it, then the change request changes from being a change request to a requirement in the system. That's why if you look at the Rommana tool, as we're going to see, you can actually create a requirement in Rommana from a change request. So we have, so that's why I always refer to something that I refer to as the source of a requirement, kind of saying, where did this requirement come from? And if the requirement has actually stemmed from a change request, then we maintain the relationship between the requirement and the change request. And guess what? The change request had to be approved first before we even create a requirement based on that. So keep that in mind. Find out if your requirement management practice has this concept of change management. Now, we all know about requirement reviews. I bet some of you, if not all of you, have already participated in a requirement review session where we sit down in a room and we look at a requirement or a user story for that purpose, and we review it and try to understand it, and we make comments about it, we elaborate on it, and all that stuff. Well, let me share with you my experience about requirement reviews. You can imagine in about 37 years of working with software and different projects, you can imagine how many times I participated in requirement review sessions and how many times I myself as a project manager have led a meeting in requirement reviews. And I have seen that those requirement review meetings do not produce good results all the time for all kinds of reasons. For the most obvious reason I've seen, and maybe you can find out if this reason is happening in your project or not. People come to the meeting not prepared for the meeting. I see people coming to the meeting to review requirements, and they have not even looked at the requirement documents before coming to the meeting. People coming to the meeting and they don't really have time to attend to that meeting. As a result, the purpose is to get to that meeting and finish it right away and just let's approve those requirements. Let's say those requirements are good to go. And then, of course, you get developers on the other side in those meetings saying, okay, let's just get started, and I'm sure we'll have more questions as we start. And that's okay, especially in the Agile framework. We don't have to understand 100% of the requirements. And of course, we all know also that it's very hard to hold a meeting because people are busy. So over the years, I have introduced what I call online collaborative reviews. Online collaborative reviews. And I have learned that, and that's especially if the if the team members are not physically co-located in the same physical place, because sometimes you want to hold a meeting but people are not around, people are traveling, or people are even offshore. Nowadays we have a lot of projects that are being offshored, so it is not uncommon to see that some of your developers or some of your QA people are in a different country on a different time zone. So as a result, the online collaborative reviews, and this is supported 100% in Rommana, helps a lot, because we do those reviews and they're not synchronous. They're not happening at the same time. They are what they call asynchronous, meaning that I post the requirement online and I request people to review it, and I make the time span very short, like 24 hours. I said, please look at this requirement, let me know if you have any question, and we need to finalize this requirement by tomorrow, for example. And people will start reading, looking at the requirement. People will start providing their comments and the questions. Everyone in the team can see the comments and the questions through the tool. And the person who's supposed to be able to answer those questions can see those. He or she can respond to the questions. Everyone can see the response to these questions and so on. And that's why it's a collaborative. And you can imagine now a response to a question may lead to another question. So someone hears an answer and he or she would say, oh, well, if that's the case, then are we also supposed to do this? Does this mean this and this and this and that? So the nice thing about the online collaborative reviews are that all these comments / questions are maintained in the tool over time, anytime, years after the release is out. Anyone can go back and ask a question, why did we do it this way? And they can go back to the history of the questions that were asked at the time and the answers that were given, and try and understand who had given the answer, why exactly we implemented the feature in this manner. I mean, again, this is my experience working with very large projects, with very large teams. You cannot afford anymore to go to a meeting and ask a question and you get an answer to the question, and the developers go off and based on the answer they write the code in a certain way, and a year later someone comes and asks, why it's not supposed to work that way, how is it working that way? What do we do now? We say, I believe we had a meeting, I believe we asked the question, I believe Joe answered the question in this manner. There is no record of anything. All right. That's very important, by the way, being able to maintain records of questions being asked and answers being given. All right. It goes without saying, requirements relate to each other in many different ways. Some requirements need to be implemented at the same time with other requirements. Some requirements need to be implemented before certain requirements. Some requirements may use something in another requirement. We cannot really overlook this. Now, again, does your requirement management software allow you to declare or to define relationships between requirements? And that's very important. Some requirements will use some of the test cases that were written for another requirement. Some requirements will use some of the code that was written for another requirement. Okay, some requirements will be totally reused as is in a different project. So this is now not within the project. So number 4 here is referring to the relationship, the general form of relationship within the project. Number 5 is referring to the fact that, or the practice that, we could be having a project here and there is a tiny requirement in this project, but that requirement has already been implemented in a different project, and you want to be able to do that. Why? Simply because you want the project team to be able to pull the code that was written and has been already done and been released, has been tested, the code they wrote for that requirement, and bring it to this project. And the test team also needs to be able to bring the test cases they wrote at the time in that first release and they used it to test the requirements, they need to be brought back here. It's not like we're going to be rewriting the code. It's not like we're going to be rerunning the test cases, but we're saying this part of the requirement has already been done before. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. So let's bring the code into this project. Why? Because it's going to have to go through the configuration management. It's going to be part of the rollout, right? It's going to be part of the implementation of the system. So I have not seen too many tools that allow you to reuse requirements from other projects. Okay. Let me peek here to see if I have any questions at this point. No. All right. Now, let's move more toward use cases. I don't know if you know about use cases or not, but use cases are a different type of entity. They're not user stories. Use cases are a much more elaborate form of requirements. Some projects use use cases. And use cases, if I have to say a few words about use cases, they are ways by which we can describe the interactions between different parts of the system. And some projects use use cases. Now we have to remember that those use cases sometimes are not sometimes. Whenever we write use cases, they're always associated with requirements, or requirements have use cases associated with them. So you cannot separate use cases from requirements. So you have, for example, a requirement that speaks about, say, for example, placing an order. And you have all details about how customers can place orders and all the business rules about placing an orders. All those are written in the requirement. Now, the project team comes and they put together a use case by which, and a use case does not, some people are confusing between use cases and scenarios. Use cases are not scenarios. Use cases have scenarios inside them, but you can write a use case that describes the interaction between the customer and the system, and between the system and the inventory system, and between the system and the invoicing system, and between the system and the other systems. So if you want to describe that kind of interactions, the only way you could do this, you do it through use cases. And when you do that, you want to maintain the relationship between the use case you're writing and the requirements. And that's why in number 6 here is depending on your project. Not every project uses use cases. So that requirement, that practice is not a mandatory practice. It depends if your project is using use cases or not. Now, there is no requirement that I have seen in my experience that does not have some sort of documents associated with it. Okay, and I'm not talking about the requirement to document. I'm talking about other documents that provide more details about the requirements. For example, you can have a requirement about whatever, a requirement about placing an order, and the requirement calculates sales taxes. I'm sure there is a table, spreadsheet of some sort that shows the different rates of sales taxes for different states. For example, I'm just giving you a very simplistic example here. So where are we going to maintain that list of rates to calculate sales taxes? It's going to be in a different document. Now, there are other documents that are on the development level that I refer to them as design models. Like, for example, you have a requirement, and in order to clarify or to understand or to provide more details about the requirement, you start building, for example, a decision table. A decision table is a model that I teach in some of my classes, and a decision table will show you how the system will react. It shows the behavior of the system. Now, where is this decision table going to go? It has to be associated with the requirement. And that's why I'm saying your requirement management tool has to allow you to associate certain types of requirement of documents, certain types of models with the requirements. That's an important practice. The simplest form, of course, is attachment. So you can, if you can put an attachment to the requirement, and the attachments show some of those documents, that's fine. All right. Now, this is now moving to the area of project management that's based on requirements. I have a number of webinars I have given. You can always listen to those on the Rommana website. I have a number of recorded webinars, and those webinars are all about what I call requirement-based project management, or feature-based requirement management. And when and that's the discipline of project management we're using within Rommana, and that's what I recommend every project manager to use. And that's about managing your project with requirements being in the focus of attention. If you want to do that, then every requirement, as you can imagine, has some tasks associated with it. Now, what do I mean by tasks? Well, you can imagine every requirement will be reviewed, will be approved, will be designed, there will be coded, it will be tested. I just listed 5 different tasks. Now, if we are going to manage our project in terms of requirements, we need to understand the status and the progress in each one of those tasks with respect to a specific requirement. So one requirement have been designed, have been coded, but have not been tested yet. Another requirement have been designed, but have not been coded yet. Another requirement has not even been reviewed yet, and so on. And not only the status and the progress, but also who is doing what, which becomes very critical in a larger project. We want to understand for this requirement who's writing the code. We're not going to have one developer who's writing the code for all requirements. This requirement, who's writing the code, who's writing the test cases, who's executing the test cases. Okay, that's very simple. Who is doing what task with which requirement? That's very important. And in Rommana, you'll see that. In Rommana ALM, you'll see that for every requirement, you can look at all the tasks that this requirement is going through, or all the tasks that will be performed for the requirement, and you can see who's doing what, who's doing this, how many hours they're spending, are they done or not, when are they going to be done, and so on. Now, of course, when we have agile projects, and I sometimes agile people come tell me, in agile project we don't do that. Why don't we do that? Why are we insisting that agile projects are always small projects that has a team of 4 or 5 people? This is not the case anymore. Agile projects are very, very large now. And if we are going to scale up agile to use in larger projects, then you cannot afford, because I hear people saying, well, no, in an agile team, every developer goes and they grab a user story, they work on it. So every developer decide what they're going to work on. And you don't want to know even who's working on what? That's amazing. I don't know how I can manage a project like that, especially if I have if I'm using a scaled agile framework that a lot of companies are using now. When you have multiple teams, and in every team you have 5, 6 developers, you can have up to 100 teams. In the scaled agile framework, we have a couple 100 teams working in the same system. And it becomes important to know the status of every single requirement. Has it been reviewed? Has it been approved? Has it been coded? Has it been tested? All that stuff. And who's doing it? All right, keep that in mind. Those are the tasks. Now, in my experience doing a project in management, I found that in the course of the project, you get sometimes a risk, a project risk, a risk that may actually hinder us from delivering the requirement or the feature. And that risk is only associated with that feature, whatever the feature is. All right, so I want to keep track of that risk. You know, for example, there's a kind of feature that will require, for example, that we use a third-party component. And let's assume that the third-party component, we are not able to find one yet, but we will find one. But there is a risk that we may not find the one that implements the functionality the way we want it to be. Don't I want to put this as a risk on this requirement? as a project manager now. I'm not talking about as a requirement engineer or as a business analyst. I'm talking about as a project manager now. I need to keep track of that risk, that there is a possibility that we may not. I mean, if I speak with my project manager and I say, or if I am the project manager, I'm speaking with my lead developer, and I say, what's the status of this requirement? And he says, we're looking for a component, a third-party component. You know, in software nowadays, we use a lot of components, a lot of reusable components. And if he says, we're looking for someone, but they say, okay, well, is there a possibility that you would not find one to do it exactly the way you do it? I mean, I remember the early days when we were implementing Rommana ALM, all right? We wanted a spelling checker on the tool, and we were able to find a spelling checker that worked on the description of the requirement within the tool. But I went back to the development lead and I said, I need also spelling checker to be automatically performed on the title of the requirement and any other field. And I remember the case. He said, I'm trying to find a tool that can apply to all the fields on the screen. And it took a while to find that. Well, in my opinion, that was a risk that's presented itself on that functionality. All right. Now, requirement traceability. I don't think I'm not inventing requirement traceability now. Requirement traceability is known for years. You should be able to trace requirements back to the code that was written. You should be able to trace requirements back to the test cases that were written. And you should be able to say, for this requirement, we had, say, 100 test cases. 80 of them were executed. 75 of them passed. 5 of them failed. Whatever. But you always go back to the requirements. And the same is true. Everyone, if you put your hand on requirement, or if the developer puts their hands on a requirement, they must be able to pull out of the version control tool, which has the code. They have to be able to pull out the code modules that have been written to implement that requirement. Because as we said earlier, if we are going to reuse that requirement in a different project, or if we are going to reuse part of the requirement in the same project, we have to be able to grab that code and reuse it, okay? And we have to be able to grab the test cases and reuse part of it, and so on. The last one I want to talk about is the ability to take a requirement and break it down into lower and lower level of details. We all know, no matter what you do, requirements are always high level. Requirements are always missing details, okay? You cannot put all the details possibly in a requirement. Otherwise, and especially nowadays in Agile, a user story is very brief. You cannot put all the details in the user story. Some Agile projects use the concept of acceptance criteria, and the acceptance criteria are meant to help us understand more and more details about the user story. I have been teaching people the concept of scenarios for over 20 years now, and I use scenarios either for user stories or for requirements. I found out scenarios, and people tell me all the time, scenarios are the best way to elaborate on requirements. So a requirement management tool must allow you to take a requirement, break it down into scenarios, and must keep those scenarios associated with the requirement. Why? Because those scenarios are what we're going to be using to write our test cases. Those scenarios are what we're going to be using to write the code. So that's why it's important when we do traceability of requirements down to the test cases, for example, we say this requirement has those 25 scenarios, and here is the code for every one of those scenarios. And you should be able to point out the code, the pieces of the code that were written for each one of the scenarios, and the test cases that were written for all the scenarios. That's why in Rommana ALM, code and test cases are always written for scenarios. All right, those are my 12 practices that, as I said, this is the result of my experience over many, many years working with requirement management. And I see a couple of questions here. Jill is asking, does that reuse of requirement mean that pointers are actually pointing to the same requirement? Or do you mean it is a copy and paste? Thank you, Jill. No, to answer your question, it is pointing to the same requirement. There is no reason to bring that requirement back to this project. So I'm going to show you this in a little bit. So you have a requirement, and you can have a place in the tool that says this requirement reuses this other requirement from this other project. You don't bring this other requirement to this project at all. The pointer to the other project only helps to do what? To bring the code from the other projects and include it in the code base of this project. Because when we roll out the feature, we want to include the code. So it is not the requirement itself that's being brought in to this project. It is the code that was written to implement the requirement that's brought into, not to the requirement management tool, but to the configuration management system. Because when we implement, when we actually roll out, when we create the build for the software, we need to include the code for that requirement. So it's not a copy and paste. Another question relating to number 5. Okay, I think I answered that question already about reusing the requirements. Another question about scenarios. Jill, I'm going to have to assume that you've taken some of my courses, because you're using terminology. You're saying are the scenarios where you introduce both positive and negative scenarios. Yes, absolutely, you're right. So obviously, I'm going to just tell that you've attended one of my courses, because I have not seen anyone else speaking about positive and negative scenarios anywhere else. So unless you attended the previous webinar as well. So anyway, yes, when we come up with scenarios for requirements, I always ask people to come up with what I call positive versus negative scenarios. And the negative scenarios are the ones we use to produce negative test cases. So Jill, your recollection is correct. Thank you. And of course, I have other webinars that dive into the details of how to write scenarios and the types of scenarios and so on. Right, I don't have any other questions to answer, so I need to move on. We have only 12 minutes left. So as I say here, all those 12 practices have been implemented in Rommana ALM. And here's Rommana ALM. I have roughly 12 minutes, if you allow me, to show you just briefly how Rommana does all those. Just to let you know, Rommana ALM is not just a requirement management tool. Requirement management and the story and user story management is just one out of 8 components within Rommana. You've got your collaboration management here, through which we do a lot of collaboration between the different members of the projects, and even the collaborative reviews I talked about are here, but they are connected to the requirement management. Remember, what's in the middle here is the repository itself, where we store all the information, and this is SQL Server database. Of course, Rommana has issue management or bug tracking, if you want to call it that way. It has the component of document management, but please remember, all this is in one tool. It's not just when I say component, it doesn't mean it's a separate tool. No, Rommana is just one tool that has all this stuff. It has even a component for use cases. It has everything to do with test management, test design, and test execution right here. So you design your test cases, you put together your test sets, you write your automated scripts, you execute the test cases, all in this component here. Really, Rommana is one tool that does everything. The only thing that it does not do here explicitly is dealing with the code, and that's why you can see Rommana is integrated with subversion SVN for code version control right here. And you can actually, the reason you have it here and there is because you can go to a requirement and you can click on a requirement, or you can click on a user story, and you can see the code that was written, but the code is not maintained within Rommana. It is maintained in SVN. You could do the same here from use cases. You can go to any use case and see the code that was written for that use case. Rommana also does not do automated test execution, but it relies on unified functional testing from HP, which is used to be called the QTP, and it allows you to push your scripts from here into UFT, and they get executed there, and then the reports come back from UFT to Rommana so that you can see all the reports here. Rommana also integrates with Jira and Bugzilla only because we have a number of customers who have used Bugzilla and Jira for years, and they wanted to maintain their bug reports there, but they want to use Rommana for everything else. So according to this, you can actually, excuse me, if a test case fails here, you can actually look at the bug report, not necessarily in Rommana itself, but in Jira or Bugzilla. So that's a quick overview of Rommana ALM. So let me go back here now into the Rommana, and what I just logged in before that. I don't know if I'm still logged in or not. Maybe not. So so what you see in front of you is a bunch of projects that are related to a system, and the system I'm looking at here is Rommana ALM. You can imagine if we believe Rommana ALM is a good tool, that we use it for managing our own projects. So Rommana ALM is the system or the product. This is a different product, this is a different product, but I'm looking at one product here, and that product has 4 different projects here. I can try to open any one of them. So I'll open this. Now we call it release 10.3 because that project was responsible for producing all the code and all the features that were implemented in release 10.3. That's back in 2010, by the way. So if I click on this to open the project, I might be already logged out, so it might ask me to log in again. Yeah, I'm probably logged out. So okay, let me log in again, quick. I'm logging in as a project manager. Right. And now, because I clicked on that project, remember 10.3, it opened it for me, but I was logged out, so I logged in again. The first thing you see when you open a project, you see this dashboard that shows you different statistics and different data about the project. And without spending any time here, because that's not the subject of my presentation, you can configure this dashboard any way you want. You can include other statistics. Here is the test execution by status. If I click here, this is issue by status if I want to see them. These are real data from the project itself, okay? So it shows you everything. So I'm going to escape over that. I'm going to go here on the top. This is where all my requirement stuff is. And here's, by the way, the change requests. And here's all the documents. And here's all the testing stuff. So let me go to the requirement screen here. And now we have 6 minutes left. I'm going to spend the 6 minutes to show you. So here's the first thing. Requirements exist in a hierarchy of details. You can see that. This is the very first practice I talked about. So, and you can have any level of details. If I wanted to create a child, that's why when any requirement has a sibling and has children to it. So this is the hierarchy of details. This is the second practice here, which is there are different types of requirements. So let me do this, and So here are, for example, quality requirements that have to do with all these, any one of those 16 things. All those are configurable, by the way. You can change anything. You can click on configurability. It says we don't call it configurability, we call it customizability. And you can change this anyone. There are some, this project 10.3 had some hardware requirements are here, and it had some implementation constraints, it had some regulations. You can add any type of requirement as you wish. That's the flexibility of the tool. And you maintain every set of requirements under the specific type. So let me go to functional requirements here and click on any one of the requirements so that we can see the details. As you can see also, the versioning is here. Next to the requirement name, there is a version number. Most requirements are version 1. So when you create a requirement for the first time, it's a version 1. I have 2 requirements here, okay, that have a second version for it, okay. Configuring attribute values, version 2, and configuring attribute values, version 1 is somewhere here. So you can look at here, configure change request attribute values. That's the title of the requirement. We have, as you can see, those requirements are actually requirements from the Rommana system. Okay, so this is version 1, this is version 2. I have here requirement number 5, configure issue report attribute values. I have version 1, I have another version 1 here. That was a glitch in the tool at the time because we created it before we implemented the versioning. So don't pay attention to that one. That's normally not supposed to happen. All right, so that's the versioning. So let me look at, it doesn't matter which one. So let me do it. Importing requirements from different sources. So I click on this. By the way, Rommana is available for you to try for free, okay, for a team of 3 people, 3 or 5, I can't remember. So if you go to the Rommana website, you should be able to, and it's available to view, to try for how long? For 60 days. We don't believe in 14 days of trial or 2 weeks or 30 days of trial. You can actually have Rommana and try it for free with a team of 3 or 4, I can't remember, for up to 60 days, because we actually want you to try Rommana in some real projects and see the functionality there. Okay, as you can see, the first thing you see here says this requirement has been implemented or baseline, so you can't make any changes. So if I try to make changes to the text of this requirement or the description, it doesn't allow me. There is no way to change anything here. All right, let me actually pick up another requirement because I want to have some things that I can play with, sort of. Okay. All right, 2 more minutes left. Okay, this requirement has not been implemented or baselined, so I can make changes if I wanted to. And if I were to make changes, anytime for anything, I can change anything. I can change the description, I can change the status, I can change anything about the requirement. And guess what? I have here, down here, something called history. If I click on the history here, it tells me every change that was made to the requirement, who made it, when they made it, and why they made it. I'm not going to click on that. And actually, the fact that there is no red number next to it, it tells you that this requirement has never been changed since it was created. If I make a change now, which I don't think I should do, it will show you 1, meaning that there has been 1 change. And if you click on the 1, okay, so here, for example, this is the documents, and this tells me that there is 1 document associated with this requirement. We can go there. Here it tells me there's 1 task associated with that requirement. Here it tells me there are 16 scenarios associated with that requirement. If I were to click here, every number in requirement is a link that opens different screen. So now it gives me all the 16 scenarios that were written for that requirement. And guess what? If I need more details, like here it's showing only the scenario name, the description, but if I want to get into the screen of the scenario, I click on the scenario number and it opens that screen, and that's about scenario number 75. It gives you all the details about scenarios. Down here, it even gives you the test cases, whether they are formal test cases or ad hoc test cases. Because in Rommana, we have two different types of test cases. I'm going to close that. I'm going to close that. I'm back here. Use cases are here, but I don't see any use cases associated with that requirement. Everything is on the same screen. Online reviews, this is the collaborative reviews I was talking about. If there hasn't been any reviews conducted for this requirement, but I could initiate a requirement review this requirements. If I go do this and I say, please review this requirement and whatever. Guess what? If I click submit, an email message would go to everyone who has been assigned to review this requirement. And the message will say that. Will says, Maggie, Hanna wanted you to review requirement number, whatever, in project number, whatever. And people can get that email. They can click on the link and they get to the requirement right away. And people can see the reviews. So I'm going to submit that. So now if you want to know who are supposed to review those requirements, who's getting the email, you go here to the collaboration center here, and it tells you about managing the collaboration groups, tell you who's supposed to review requirements in this project. So right now, I'm looking here, I have only one person that's supposed to review requirements in this project. These are all the people within this project. But somehow, okay, Jane, this is all, I use this for demos, by the way. So Jane is supposed to participate on all these things, requirement reviews, scenario reviews, use case reviews, and so on. I can certainly add other people. Oh, actually, this person, oh, why did I say that? Okay, this person also, this is simply say click all of them. But if I don't click all of them, so I can specify who's supposed to review what. Let me close that. All right, I am 2 minutes beyond my time. So I will peek quickly to see if there is any questions they need to answer. I have a question here, says, why is the priority of the scenario is a floating value? We looked at the scenario screen, and we found out that the priority of the scenario can be 1.3, 1.66, and so on. And the reason is because the priority is calculated based on 3 factors. I did not dive into this. And the 3 factors are the criticality of the feature, the risk of the feature. There are three factors that are used to calculate the priority, and we get a number between 1 and 3, either 1.0, 1.1. I can explain this. If you go to one of my recorded webinars about scenarios and risk-based testing, it describes this scheme of how to calculate the priority of the scenario in much more details. For now, I'd like to close my webinar and give control back to Eric. Thank you so much for attending the webinar. I hope I'll meet you in other webinars. Don't remember that you can go to the Rommana website. You can try Rommana for free for 60 days for up to, I'm going to have to say 3 people if I don't remember correctly. All right. And you can try everything in Rommana. Eric?
Thank you, Dr. Hanna, for your time today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar sponsored by Rommana Software, the leader in application lifecycle management technology. For more information on how Rommana Software can help you or your organization, please visit rommanasoftware.com. Again, be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, User Acceptance Testing in Agile Environment by Philip Liu, on September 14th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to testinginstitute.com. You can follow Rommana on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about Rommana news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you, Dr. Hanna.
Thank you, Eric.